I'll expand the story to the full 13,000 words with deeper emotional development, additional scenes, and richer character arcs. The metal gleamed under the noon sun like a thread of silver stitching through the sand, and Harold Brennan felt his knees buckle when he realized what his wife had just uncovered with her hiking stick. Sarah stood frozen 3 yards ahead, her shadow falling across the rusted rail that protruded from the desert floor at an impossible angle, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. He stumbled forward, the storage unit key still warm in his pocket from the foreclosure auction that morning, and touched the cold iron with trembling fingers, because this was the same rail, the exact pattern of bolts and ties that his father had described in the last letter Harold never answered 43 years ago. Wait, before you see what's inside. If this story already has your heart pounding, tell us where you're watching from. When forgotten boxes open, when second chances hide under dust and debt, subscribe and stay close. You'll never guess what's been left behind. Now, back to the lock clicking open. The morning had started with humiliation. Harold and Sarah Brennan had driven their failing '98 Corolla to the Desert Valley auction with exactly $217 in cash, their entire savings after the medical bills had consumed everything else. Sarah's chemotherapy was in remission, but the debts weren't. At 72 and 70 years old, respectively, they'd become the kind of people who bid on abandoned storage units, hoping for miracles in moldy boxes. The auctioneer, a sunburned man with a voice like gravel in a blender, had barely glanced at them when Harold raised his hand for Unit 47. "$225 to the old-timer in the Diamondbacks cap," Rick had announced, and Harold felt the word old-timer land like a stone in his chest. They'd won the bid at $200 even, their last $200. The unit had been registered to someone named Martin Kowalski, deceased 6 months prior, no next of kin. When Rick cut the lock and rolled up the door, Harold had expected the usual detritus: broken furniture, water-damaged books, maybe a box of costume jewelry if they were lucky. Instead, they found a single item: a wooden crate 4 feet long and 3 feet wide, wrapped in canvas so old it crumbled at Sarah's touch. Stenciled on the side in faded black paint, Southern Pacific Railway Company, Phoenix Division, 1952. Harold's father had worked for Southern Pacific, had died working for them actually, in 1982, in an accident the company had sealed under legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements that Harold's mother had signed with shaking hands. "We should open it at home," Sarah had said, reading the tension in his shoulders. But Harold couldn't wait. He'd pried the crate open right there in the storage unit with a crowbar Rick had loaned him, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, he'd found maps. Dozens of them, hand-drawn survey maps of the Arizona desert, each one marked with X's and dates and coordinates, and one word repeated across multiple sheets in his father's unmistakable handwriting: proof. And beneath the maps, a photograph. His father, young and grinning, standing beside a section of railway track in the middle of empty desert, holding a shovel. On the back, in pencil, the line they said didn't exist, 1967. The other bidders had already moved on to Unit 48, their voices echoing through the corridor of metal doors. Rick lingered near Harold, curious now. "You find something good?" "I found something," Harold said, his voice hollow. He couldn't explain that he'd found his father's ghost, his father's secrets, maybe his father's redemption. The maps felt like artifacts from another world, hand-drawn with the precision of someone who'd walked every mile, measured every marker. Sarah had driven while Harold sat in the passenger seat with the crate on his lap, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't unfold the maps. She'd pulled off Highway 60 near Apache Junction, where the coordinates from the first map indicated, and they'd walked into the desert with bottles of water and her hiking stick, following a trail that shouldn't have been there. And now, here was the rail, emerging from sand and creosote bush like a bone from old earth. Harold knelt beside it, his arthritic fingers tracing the bolt pattern. Sarah crouched next to him, one hand on his shoulder. The desert stretched around them in every direction, silent except for the whisper of wind through the Palo Verde trees. "How is this possible?" she whispered. The official story, the one Harold had heard his entire adult life, was that his father, Thomas Brennan, had been a maintenance supervisor who died in a routine track inspection accident near Yuma. A tragic fall, a settlement, a closed case. But Thomas had written Harold a letter 3 months before he died. Harold had been 31 then, angry and estranged from his father over old wounds he could barely remember now. He'd read the first line, "They're making me bury the truth," and thrown it away, too proud and too stubborn to care. He'd never read the rest. His mother had died 2 years later without ever speaking of it. She'd taken whatever she knew to her grave. And Harold had been so consumed with building his own life, his career as an accountant, his marriage, raising their daughter Jennifer, that he'd let the past stay buried. Until Jennifer died. Ovarian cancer, just like what had nearly taken Sarah. Jennifer had been 42. The same age Harold's father had been in that photograph from 1967. The symmetry of it had broken something in Harold, cracked open a space where old regrets could finally breathe. "There's more track," Sarah said, pointing with her stick. She was right. Now that they knew what to look for, Harold could see it. A faint linear depression in the sand, running northeast toward the Superstition Mountains. Every 20 yards or so, another section of rail poked through, covered by decades of drift and desert varnish. Harold pulled the maps from his jacket. The first one showed this exact location, marked with the date November 14th, 1967. His father would have been 42, Harold's current age in the photograph. The notation beside the X read, "Mile marker 1, line begins here. They buried the workers 2 miles east." Harold's blood went cold. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what if Dad didn't die in an accident?" She looked at him with those steady blue eyes that had seen him through 4 decades of marriage, through the loss of their daughter, through cancer, through poverty. "Then we follow these rails," she said, "and we find out what he wanted you to know." They stood together in the November heat, 2 people in their 70s with bad knees and failing savings, staring at evidence of something that had been hidden for more than half a century. Harold thought about turning back. They could sell the maps to a museum maybe, get enough money to pay rent for another month. But his father's handwriting on those maps, careful, precise, desperate, wouldn't let him walk away. "Okay," Harold said, "we follow it." They walked for 2 hours, following the buried railway through the Sonoran wasteland. The November sun pressed down on them like a physical weight, and Harold felt every one of his 72 years in his knees, in his back, in the way his breath came short and sharp. Sarah's face had gone red, despite her wide-brimmed hat, and twice Harold made her stop to drink water and rest in the shade of a cigarro. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her hands trembled when she lifted the bottle. "We can come back tomorrow," Harold said, "with better supplies, a GPS." "Your father walked this alone," Sarah replied, "for years probably. We can make it 2 miles. But Harold kept watching her, remembering the hospital rooms, the chemo drips, the way she'd looked so small in those beds. She'd beaten the cancer, but it had cost them everything, their savings, their house, their retirement. They'd moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Mesa that smelled like mildew and defeat. The storage unit auction had been Sarah's idea. "Maybe we'll find something valuable," she'd said with forced optimism. "People leave all kinds of things behind." At mile marker 3, they found the first cairn. It rose from the desert floor like a miniature monument, stones carefully stacked, deliberate and human. Sarah circled it slowly while Harold checked the map. The notation here read, "Cairn 3, Martinez." "Someone's buried here," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father marked graves," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. Harold knelt beside the cairn and touched the stones. They were hot from the sun, weathered smooth by decades of wind. His father had built this, had carried these stones, stacked them with care, marked a man's final resting place when no one else would. The weight of it pressed on Harold's chest like a physical thing. They found 6 more cairns over the next mile, each one marked on the map with a name: Chen, Kowalski, Redbird, Brennan. Harold stopped at that last one. His father's surname, but the first name was different: Michael. "My uncle," Harold breathed, "Dad's younger brother. He died in Korea. At least that's what Grandma always said." Sarah knelt beside the cairn marked Brennan, M, and gently touched the topmost stone. What if he didn't? The map notation for this cairn was longer than the others. Michael Brennan, age 19, July 1952, heat stroke, they wouldn't stop for water. Harold sat down hard in the sand, the map trembling in his hands. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. A raven called from somewhere overhead, its voice harsh and lonely. Michael, his uncle, a man Harold had never known existed beyond a single faded photograph on his grandmother's mantel. Died serving his country, Grandma had always said when young Harold asked about the serious-looking teenager in the army uniform. But there was no army uniform in this grave, just a 19-year-old boy who died of thirst while building a railway line that didn't officially exist. The pieces were assembling into a nightmare. 1952, the same year stenciled on the crate. Southern Pacific Railway had been expanding aggressively through Arizona in the early 50s, building freight lines to connect Phoenix to the mining operations in the eastern mountains. Harold had researched his father's career once, years ago, trying to understand the man he'd pushed away. But he'd never found mention of this line. "They built a railway with prison labor," Harold said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke. Or something like it. Undocumented workers, maybe, men no one would miss, and when they died from the heat or the work, the company buried them and, what, covered it up? Sarah's face had gone pale beneath her sun hat. "Your father found out." "And tried to expose it," Harold finished. "That's what the letter meant. They're making me bury the truth." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He knew where these men were. He probably helped bury his own brother. The horror of it made Harold's stomach turn. He imagined his father, 22 years old in 1952, fresh out of the Navy, taking a job with the railroad to support his widowed mother, watching his baby brother die in the desert heat, being forced to dig the grave, stack the stones, keep the secret. 30 years of silence. 30 years of drinking and nightmares and guilt that Harold had interpreted as weakness. "We need to keep going," Harold said, standing with effort. "The map shows the line ends at mile marker 7. There's something marked there." He wrote "The Proof" in capital letters. Sarah struggled to her feet, wincing. Harold saw the pain in her face and felt fear spike through him. "Maybe we should call someone, the police, or—" "And tell them what?" Sarah interrupted. "That we found some old maps in a storage unit? That we think there are unmarked graves in the desert based on our dead father-in-law's handwriting? They'll think we're senile." She was right. They had no proof yet. Just maps and cairns and a growing certainty that something terrible had happened here. They walked on. The sun was starting its descent toward the western hills when they reached mile marker 7. Harold's water was nearly gone, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Sarah leaned heavily on her hiking stick, her breathing labored. But they'd made it. The railway tracks ended abruptly at the mouth of a canyon Harold didn't recognize from any map he'd ever seen. The walls rose steep and red on either side, and in the canyon's shadow, someone had built a structure. Not a building, a shrine. Railroad ties had been arranged in a rectangular frame, and within that frame, driven into the hard-packed earth, were dozens of crosses. Wooden crosses, metal crosses, crosses made from rebar and wire. Each one marked with a name and a date, all from 1952. Harold counted them twice, his lips moving silently. 47 crosses in total. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered. "Harold, oh my God." Harold felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying. 47 men. 47 lives reduced to rough crosses in a hidden canyon, tended by a man whose own life had been destroyed by the secret he'd kept. At the center of the shrine stood a larger cross, made from actual railway rails welded together. A metal box hung from it, weathered but intact. Harold's hands shook as he lifted it down and opened the rusted clasp. Inside was a journal. His father's journal. The leather cover had been worn smooth by years of handling. Harold opened it carefully, and his father's handwriting swam before his eyes, the same neat, precise script from the maps. The first entry was dated May 3, 1952. "They've put me on the Phoenix Extension project. Supervisor says we're behind schedule, need to push the crew harder. Most of these men don't speak English. Some of them are kids. My brother Michael begged me to get him hired on. $16 a week. He's so young. I should have said no, but Ma needs the money, and Michael won't listen to anyone." Harold's throat closed. He flipped through the pages, his vision blurring. The entries documented everything. Names of foremen who withheld water as punishment. Dates when men collapsed from heat exhaustion and were left to die because stopping work would cost the company money. Descriptions of how the bodies were buried in shallow graves and the deaths never reported. July 14, 1952. "Michael died today. My baby brother." The heat index was 118 degrees, and Foreman Davies wouldn't let us break for water until the next rail section was laid. Michael collapsed at 2 p.m. By the time they let me reach him, he was gone. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes were open. I couldn't close them. They buried him after sunset with the others. Davies told me if I reported it, he'd make sure our whole family ended up in graves out here. I believe him. I've seen what these men are capable of. Ma can never know how he really died. I'll tell her it was an accident, quick and painless. I'll tell her he didn't suffer. I'm a coward. Harold's knees gave out. Sarah caught him, held him while he sobbed into her shoulder. For his father, for his uncle, for 47 men whose names had been erased from history. The journal trembled in his hands, and he couldn't stop reading. August 2, 1952. 7 more dead this week. The company doctor left yesterday, just packed his bags and drove away. Before he left, he told me he was tired of filling out death certificates that said natural causes when he knew it was murder. Told me he was going to report everything to the State Labor Board. They found his car in a ravine 3 days later. Single vehicle accident, they said. I know better. Harold felt Sarah's arms around him, heard her crying too, but he kept reading, compelled by the need to witness what his father had witnessed, to carry what his father had carried. September 15, 1952. The line is abandoned. Project supervisor got word from corporate yesterday. Phoenix Extension is officially canceled. Engineering difficulties, they're calling it. We're to cover the tracks, destroy all documentation, and never speak of this job again. We spent 3 days burying rails, covering the evidence, erasing 47 men from existence. They gave everyone on the crew a bonus, $200 cash, blood money. I wanted to refuse it, But Ma needed medicine, and I'm a coward, so I took it. The entries continued sporadically through the years. Harold's father had returned to the site annually, maintaining the graves, adding crosses as he learned names of the dead from old crew manifests he'd stolen. 1955. Found out Chen's first name was Wei. He was 16. Came from California looking for work. His family probably still thinks he abandoned them. 1960. Built a larger cross from old rails I salvaged from a scrapped locomotive. Needs something permanent here. Something that will last after I'm gone. 1967. I tried to tell Harold today. Wrote him a letter explaining everything. But he won't even speak to me. Too angry about things that don't matter anymore. I don't blame him. I wasn't a good father. I was too busy being eaten alive by ghosts. Harold closed his eyes, the weight of those words crushing. He remembered 1967. Remembered being angry at his father for missing his college graduation because of a work commitment. Remembered the letter arriving a few days later. Remembered reading the first line and throwing it away in disgust. I'm a coward, he'd said then, unknowingly echoing his father's own words about himself. The final entries in the journal were from 1982. I can't carry this anymore. 15 years I've kept their secret. 15 years I've been a coward. I've documented everything, every name I could learn, every grave I could mark. I've drawn maps, I've saved documents. When I'm gone, someone needs to know. I tried to tell Harold, but he won't speak to me. Maybe someday he'll forgive me for being weak. I should have fought them when Michael died. I should have burned their whole operation down. Should have gone to the newspapers, the police, the governor. Should have done something other than take their blood money and keep quiet. Harold turned to the last page, dated September 1982, 2 months before his father's death. They know I've been coming out here. They've warned me twice, once through a phone call in the middle of the night, once through a man who followed me home from work. They told me to forget, to let the dead stay buried. I don't care anymore. I'm old and I'm sick and I'm tired of living with ghosts. If they want to silence me, let them try. At least I'll die doing something right. If anyone finds this journal, please know, these 47 men were real. They had names, they had families. They died building a railway that made rich men richer, and when they became inconvenient, they were erased. Don't let them stay erased. Harold looked up at Sarah through his tears. They killed him. The accident was a lie. She held him tighter, her own face wet with tears. What do we do? Harold looked at the shrine, at the crosses standing silent witness in the fading light, at the journal in his hands, his father's final testimony. All the evidence Thomas Brennan had spent decades collecting. All the courage it had taken for a broken man to keep coming back to this place, keep maintaining these graves, keep believing that someday the truth would matter. We make sure the world knows, Harold said. They hiked back to the car in darkness, using Sarah's phone flashlight to navigate. Harold carried the journal against his chest like a sacred text. His legs screamed with every step, and twice he had to stop because the world tilted sideways. Sarah's breathing had gone ragged, but she wouldn't let him carry her pack. When they reached the Corolla, they found someone waiting. An old man, maybe 80, leaning against a newer pickup truck. He wore a Southern Pacific Railway cap and held a tire iron loosely in one hand. The truck's headlights illuminated him like a figure in a spotlight. Thin as a rail himself, weathered face, eyes that reflected the light like a coyote's. Harold stopped 10 feet away. Sarah moved closer to him. You shouldn't have come here, the old man said. Who are you? Harold asked, positioning himself between the man and Sarah. Name's Davies. Ben Davies. My father was Richard Davies. The old man's face was a roadmap of wrinkles and old sun damage. He was the foreman on the Phoenix extension. Harold's grip tightened on the journal. His father's words echoed in his mind. Foreman Davies wouldn't let us break for water. My father followed orders, Davies said, his voice flat, and died knowing what he'd done. Drank himself to death in 1971. But before that, he made me promise something. Made me swear I'd watch this place. Make sure nobody ever found what your daddy buried out here. Harold felt rage bloom in his chest, hot and sharp. You've been guarding a mass grave for 50 years? I've been keeping my father's secrets, Davies corrected. Same as your daddy kept his. My father built a memorial, Harold shot back. He spent his life making sure these men weren't forgotten. That's not the same thing. Davies tilted his head, considering. No, I suppose it's not. He lowered the tire iron and set it in his truck bed. How did you know where to look? Storage unit auction, someone named Kowalski. Davies nodded slowly. Martin Kowalski, Polish fellow who worked the line with your daddy. They were friends, I think. Kowalski helped your daddy maintain this place for years. How did you know we'd come? Sarah asked. Davies smiled without warmth. Bought that storage unit myself, under a fake name 6 months ago. Been waiting to see if any Brennans would show up at the auction. Kowalski's kids sold off the storage when the old man passed. I made sure it ended up in an auction I could monitor. He paused. I needed to know. Know what? If the next generation had the spine the last one did. Davies reached into his truck and pulled out a cardboard box. These are my father's personal records. Time cards showing the real crew numbers. Payroll documents the company thought they destroyed. Medical reports from the company doctor who quit in '52 after they told him to stop recording heat-related deaths. He set the box on the ground between them. Harold stared at it like it might explode. Why would you help us? Harold demanded. Davies was quiet for a long moment. I'm 83 years old. I got cancer in my lungs and maybe 6 months left. All my life I've been guarding my father's shame, keeping his secrets. But I'm tired, Mr. Brennan. I'm so damn tired. He looked at the dark canyon where the shrine waited. I came out here once, back in the '70s. Saw what your daddy built. Saw those crosses. Saw the journal, even though I knew I shouldn't touch it. I read every word. His voice cracked. 47 men. My father killed 47 men because the company cared more about schedules than lives. He made choices, Harold said coldly. He did, Davies agreed. And I've spent my whole life paying for them. Never married, never had kids. How could I, knowing what I came from? He met Harold's eyes. Your daddy was a good man who made one mistake. He thought he had to fight alone. He tried to expose this in '67, and they threatened his family. Threatened you specifically, Mr. Brennan. Told him if he went public, you'd end up in a grave next to Michael. So he backed down, but he never stopped documenting, never stopped maintaining those graves. That's more courage than most men ever find. Harold felt the air leave his lungs. They threatened me? You were 31, living in Tempe, working at Henderson and Associates. They knew where you lived, where you worked, what kind of car you drove. Davies recited the facts like scripture. My father told me about it before he died. Said it was the only time he ever saw Thomas Brennan cry. Your daddy chose you over justice. Can't say I blame him. Harold thought about the letter. The first line he'd read before throwing it away. They're making me bury the truth. He'd thought his father was being melodramatic. He'd been so wrong about everything. Sarah's hand found his. What happens now? Davies pushed the box closer with his foot. Now you take these records. You take that journal. and you make sure those 47 men get justice, even if it's 70 years late. The company will fight this, Harold said. They'll have lawyers, resources. Union Pacific absorbed Southern Pacific in 1996, Davy said. Different executives, different era. They might fight, or they might cut their losses and settle. Either way, the story gets told. He climbed into his truck. There's a reporter in Phoenix, Maria Santos at the Republic. She's been investigating historical labor abuses by mining and railway companies. She'll listen. She'll believe you. Why should I trust you? Harold called after him. Davies paused with his hand on the door. Because I just gave you everything you need to destroy my father's memory, and I'm okay with that. Some things matter more than family pride. He started the engine. Your daddy couldn't finish this fight. Maybe you can. The truck's taillights disappeared into the desert darkness, leaving Harold and Sarah alone with 2 boxes of evidence and a sky full of stars. They drove through the night to Phoenix in silence. The journal sat on Harold's lap, and he kept touching it every few miles to make sure it was real. Sarah drove with both hands tight on the wheel, her face drawn with exhaustion. Around 3 a.m., she pulled into a rest stop. We need to sleep. We can't, Harold said. What if Davies changes his mind? What if he comes back for the evidence? Then we'll deal with it in the morning, Sarah said firmly. You're no good to anyone if you have a heart attack from exhaustion. They reclined their seats as far as they'd go and tried to sleep. Harold closed his eyes and saw crosses. 47 of them. 47 names his father had collected like sacred relics. Sarah, he whispered into the darkness, what if no one cares? What if it's been too long? Then we'll have tried, Sarah replied. That's more than anyone else did. But Harold thought about media cycles, about how quickly stories disappeared, about how easy it was for the world to forget. 47 men had already been forgotten once. What if he failed to make them matter again? He must have slept eventually, because dawn woke him. Bright Arizona sun turning the sky pink and gold. Sarah was already awake, sipping water from a bottle and watching him with concern. You were crying in your sleep, she said softly. Harold wiped his face. I dreamed about Michael, about Dad having to bury him, about being 22 years old and losing your baby brother and not being able to tell anyone. Sarah took his hand. We're going to make this right. They drove the rest of the way to Phoenix and checked into a Motel 6 with the last $30 in their account. The room smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but it had a bed and a table, and that was enough. Harold spread everything out methodically. His father's journal, the maps, Davy's documents, photographs he pulled from the metal box at the shrine. He organized them by date, by category, by relevance. Sarah made coffee from the in-room maker and helped him build a timeline. The documents from Davies were damning. Time cards that showed 87 workers on the Phoenix Extension Project in May 1952 and only 40 by September. Payroll records listing names that appeared for a few weeks and then vanished. A medical examiner's preliminary report from July 1952, never filed officially, listing environmental heat exposure as cause of death for 6 men in a single week. This is enough, Sarah said quietly. Harold, this is more than enough. But Harold kept working. He transcribed key passages from his father's journal. He cross-referenced names from the crosses with names on the payroll documents. He found matches, 18 of them. Wei Chen, Martin Kowalska-Spiegel Joseph, a man named Red Bird whose death certificate listed his age as 17. By noon, Harold had built a case file that would have made any prosecutor proud. Now what? Sarah asked. Harold looked at his phone. Now we call Maria Santos. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Harold called the Arizona Republic and asked for Maria Santos. The receptionist tried to redirect him to general news, but Harold said 5 words that got him through. Mass graves on railway property. He was transferred. The phone rang twice. Maria Santos. Her voice was crisp, professional. Harold took a breath. My name is Harold Brennan. My father worked for Southern Pacific Railway. In 1952, 47 men died building a railway line in the Arizona desert. The company buried them and covered it up. I have evidence. There was a pause. Then, can you be more specific about the evidence? My father's journal documenting every death. Company payroll records showing workers who vanished. Medical reports the company never filed. Maps showing where the graves are located. Photographs of a memorial my father maintained for 30 years. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Brennan, are you saying you have physical proof of 47 unlawful deaths? Yes. Where are you right now? Phoenix, Motel 6 on Van Buren. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Maria Santos arrived in 23 minutes. She was 40, sharp-eyed, with a recorder already visible in her shirt pocket when Harold opened the door. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Show me everything," she said. Harold showed her. He started with his father's journal, letting her read key entries. He watched her face change, skepticism giving way to focus, focus hardening into something like anger. She photographed every page with her phone, her fingers steady. Then the maps, the payroll documents, the medical examiner's report, the photographs from the shrine. Maria Santos didn't speak for 2 hours. She just documented, cross-referenced, took notes in a shorthand Harold couldn't read. Finally, she looked up. "This is going to be ugly." "I know," Harold said. Southern Pacific doesn't exist anymore. They merged with Union Pacific in '96. But corporate successor liability is real. You're talking about a story that could trigger lawsuits, federal investigations, possible criminal charges for anyone still alive who was involved in the cover-up. She paused. "You understand you're going to be at the center of this? Your life won't be private anymore. People will question your motives, your father's credibility, whether this is some kind of scam. Corporate lawyers will try to destroy both of you." Harold thought about his father, alone in the desert, maintaining graves for men no one remembered. He thought about Michael Brennan, 19 years old, dying of thirst. "My father spent 40 years protecting these men to memory while everyone called him a drunk and a failure," Harold said. "Including me. I owe him this. I owe them this." Maria looked at Sarah. "And you're prepared for this too?" Sarah squeezed Harold's hand. "My husband spent his whole life regretting how he treated his father. This is his chance to make it right. I'm with him." Maria packed up her recorder and notebooks. "Give me 72 hours. I need to verify everything I can independently. Contact labor historians, get expert opinions on the documents, reach out to Union Pacific for comment. I want to find descendants of the men named in that journal. Get their side." She stood. "This runs Sunday, front page, full spread. But I need you to be absolutely sure, Mr. Brennan. Once this publishes, there's no going back. Your father's life will be examined. So will yours. Are you ready for that?" Harold thought about the storage unit, about spending their last $200 on a crate of maps, about following rails into the desert because he had nothing left to lose and everything to make right. "Print it," Harold said. Maria Santos spent 72 hours becoming an expert on the Phoenix Extension Project. She called Harold 6 times with questions. Where exactly was the site? Could she verify the coordinates? Did he have the original maps or just copies? Who was Ben Davies and how could she reach him? Harold answered everything. He gave her GPS coordinates, he scanned every document, and emailed high-resolution copies. He told her about Davies, though he suspected the old man wouldn't want to talk. He was right. Maria called him Friday afternoon. "Davies won't speak on record, but I tracked down his nephew, who confirmed that Richard Davies worked for Southern Pacific in the '50s and died of cirrhosis in 1971. The nephew also said his uncle carried heavy guilt and used to talk about the men in the desert when he was drunk. "Is that enough?" Harold asked. Combined with everything else? Yes. Maria's voice carried a weight Harold recognized, the burden of truth. "I reached out to 3 labor historians. All of them say the pattern is consistent with known corporate practices from that era. Companies routinely hired undocumented workers or men from unemployment lines for dangerous projects, then discarded them when convenient." She paused. "I also found descendants." Harold's heart jumped. "Of who?" "Wei Chen's granddaughter lives in San Francisco. She's been trying to find out what happened to her grandfather for 20 years. When I told her we'd found his grave, she broke down." Maria's voice softened. "There are others. A great-nephew of Joseph Kowalski, 2 relatives of a man named Flores. These families have been searching for answers, Harold. You're giving them closure." Harold felt tears on his face. "When does it run?" "Sunday morning, front page, above the fold. 12,000 words with full documentation. I'm titling it, 'The Railway of Ghosts: How 47 Men Died Building a Line History Forgot.'" Harold closed his eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Maria said. "Thank your father. He's the one who wouldn't let them stay forgotten." The story broke on Sunday, November 16, 2025, under the headline Maria had promised. Harold and Sarah bought 10 copies of the Arizona Republic from a convenience store and sat in their motel room reading it over and over. Maria Santos had written a masterpiece. She'd woven together his father's journal entries, the documentary evidence, interviews with historians, and heart-wrenching quotes from descendants who'd searched for years for information about missing relatives. She'd tracked down the company doctor's grandson, who confirmed his grandfather had quit Southern Pacific in 1952 and had nightmares about men dying in the heat until his own death in 1995. She'd found safety reports from other Southern Pacific projects in the same era, showing a pattern of neglect and cover-ups. She even included a photograph of Harold holding his father's journal at the shrine, crosses visible in the background. The caption read, "Harold Brennan, 72, displays his father's documentation of 47 deaths that Southern Pacific Railway allegedly covered up in 1952. By noon Sunday, the story had been picked up by the Associated Press. By Monday morning, CNN was leading with it. By Tuesday, Union Pacific's legal department released a statement. "We are deeply troubled by these allegations and are cooperating fully with authorities to investigate the historical circumstances described in recent media reports. Union Pacific did not exist in 1952 and bears no responsibility for the alleged actions of Southern Pacific Railway. However, we recognize the gravity of these claims and are committed to transparency." By Wednesday, the Arizona Attorney General announced a formal inquiry into the deaths and the cover-up. Harold and Sarah's motel room phone rang constantly. Producers wanted movie rights. Lawyers offered to represent them pro bono in wrongful death suits. Historians wanted access to the journal for research. Descendants of the buried men reached out, crying, thanking them for giving their grandfathers and great-uncles names again. Wei Chen's granddaughter, Linda, flew to Phoenix on Thursday. She was 68, an accountant like Harold had been, with her grandfather's eyes. She met them at a coffee shop and cried when Harold showed her the journal entry about her grandfather. "He was 16, Linda whispered, touching the page. "My grandmother told us he went to find work and never came home. She waited for letters that never came. She died still waiting." Harold watched this woman mourn a grandfather she'd never known and felt his father's presence like a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas Brennan gave me proof my grandfather existed," Linda said, "that he mattered. I can bury him properly now, give him a headstone with his real name." She looked at Harold. "Thank you for finishing what your father started." But Harold only cared about one call. On Thursday afternoon, a representative from the National Park Service contacted him, a woman named Rebecca Mills, with a voice that reminded Harold of his daughter. "Mr. Brennan, we've been following the story. The NPS is very interested in designating the railway site and your father's shrine as a historic landmark. She paused. These kinds of sites, places that document labor abuses, forgotten histories, the lives of marginalized people, they're incredibly important for national memory. We'd like to protect this place, properly mark the graves, create a memorial that tells the story to future generations. Harold couldn't speak. Sarah took the phone. What would this involve? Sarah asked. We'd work with archaeologists to properly map and protect the graves. We'd preserve your father-in-law's shrine exactly as he built it. We'd create educational materials explaining what happened here and why it matters. Rebecca paused. And we'd like to name it the Thomas Brennan Memorial Site, in honor of his courage in preserving this history. Would that be acceptable to the family? Sarah looked at Harold. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, Sarah said, that would be acceptable. The formal dedication of the Thomas Brennan Memorial Site happened 6 months later. The Park Service had worked with astonishing speed, motivated by media attention and pressure from labor rights organizations. Harold and Sarah stood in the desert sun, now properly shaded by a pavilion the Park Service had constructed. The cairns his father had built were now surrounded by a proper memorial garden with desert plants and shaded walkways. The crosses had been carefully preserved and mounted under protective glass in a climate-controlled structure. His father's journal sat in a display case, open to the page describing Michael's death, with interpretive text explaining the context. A bronze plaque had been installed at the entrance. Thomas Brennan Memorial Site. In memory of 47 men who died building the Phoenix Extension Railway line in 1952, and in honor of Thomas Brennan, 1930 to 1982, who devoted his life to ensuring they would not be forgotten. Don't let them stay erased. More than 300 people attended the dedication ceremony. Descendants of the dead men, some who'd flown in from California, Colorado, Mexico. Labor rights activists, historians from universities across the Southwest, journalists, including Maria Santos, and, standing alone in the back, Ben Davies. He looked smaller than Harold remembered, eaten away by the cancer that was killing him. But his eyes were clear when Harold walked over after the ceremony. "Thank you," Harold said. Davies shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank your daddy. He's the one who wouldn't let them stay forgotten." He looked at the memorial, at the names carved in stone on a new monument listing all 47 men. "I got maybe a month left, but I'm glad I lived long enough to see this." "Did you make peace with your father?" Harold asked. "No," Davy said honestly. "But I made peace with what he did. That's not the same thing, but it's something." He gestured toward the memorial. "My daddy was a coward who chose money over mercy. Your daddy was a hero who chose memory over safety. I can't change which man my father was, but I could help finish what yours started." He offered his hand. Harold shook it. "There's one more thing," Davy said. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "My will. I'm leaving everything to the memorial fund, about $300,000. It's not much, but it should help maintain this place." He pressed the envelope into Harold's hands. "Make sure those crosses never fall down." "I will," Harold promised. Davies died 3 weeks later in a hospice in Tucson. His obituary, written by Maria Santos, mentioned his role in helping preserve the railway site. It described him as a man who spent his final months seeking redemption for his father's sins. It was more kindness than he'd asked for, and exactly what he deserved. The lawsuits took 2 years to settle. Union Pacific, facing overwhelming evidence and crushing public pressure, established a $47 million fund, $1 million for each documented death. The money went to verified descendants and to a scholarship program for children of railroad workers. Harold and Sarah received $200,000 as Thomas Brennan's heirs. It was more money than they'd seen in their lives. They used it to buy a small house in Mesa, 10 miles from the memorial site. Sarah's cancer remained in remission. They paid off their medical debts. They helped establish a college scholarship in Jennifer's name. And Harold volunteered as a docent at the memorial, telling visitors about his father, about the forgotten men, about the price of silence. Every Thursday, he drove out to the site and walked the old railway line. He'd bring water for the plants, check that the crosses were secure, read entries from his father's journal to school groups who came to learn. Sometimes, descendants of the buried men would visit. Harold would walk with them to their grandfather's or great-uncle's grave, would tell them what his father had written about them, would share the dignity of remembrance. Wei Chen's granddaughter Linda came quarterly. She'd installed a proper headstone at her grandfather's grave, carved stone with his name in English and Chinese characters. She'd bring flowers and sit for hours, talking to a man she'd never met. Joseph Kowalski's nephew funded a bench near the shrine, with a plaque reading, "Rest here and remember those who could not rest." The families had claimed their dead, and in doing so had claimed their histories. On the first anniversary of the memorial's dedication, Harold stood alone at his father's cairn. Thomas Brennan had been buried in Yuma in 1982, in a pauper's grave his widow could barely afford. But Harold had arranged for a memorial stone here, among the men his father had protected. The stone read simply, "Thomas Brennan, 1930 to 1982. He kept faith with the forgotten." "I'm sorry I didn't read your letter," Harold said to the desert wind. "I'm sorry, I thought you were weak. You were the strongest man I ever knew, and I was too stupid and proud to see it." He placed a hand on the stone, warm from the sun. A family was visiting Wei Chen's grave nearby, Linda and her adult children. 3 generations come to honor one teenager who died building a railway. "But I see it now, Dad," Harold continued. "The whole world sees it. You made sure they'd be remembered, and now you're remembered too. Not as a drunk or a failure, as a hero." A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. In the distance, the Superstition Mountains rose purple and ancient against the sky. The old railway tracks, now protected behind velvet ropes and informational plaques, gleamed in the afternoon light. Visitors walked the memorial paths, reading interpretive signs that told the story of the Phoenix Extension. School children sketched the crosses for history projects. A photographer from National Geographic was documenting the site for an upcoming feature. Harold thought about the storage unit, about those last $200, about the decision to follow rails into the desert, how desperation had led to discovery, discovery to justice, justice to redemption. "Where they led changed my life forever," Harold whispered. "Thank you for leaving me the map. Thank you for trusting me to finish what you started." He walked back to where Sarah waited by the car, her hand extended for his. They drove home together through the desert twilight, past the memorial that bore his father's name, past the graves that no longer held forgotten men, past the place where silence had finally been broken by truth. Behind them, the shrine his father had built stood watch over the railway of ghosts, no longer hidden, no longer lost, no longer alone in the dark. The sun set red and gold over the Sonoran wasteland, painting the sky with colors like redemption, like memory, like the kind of peace that comes when the truth finally, impossibly, miraculously wins. And somewhere in that fading light, Harold felt his father's presence, not as a ghost, but as a legacy. Not as shame, but as honor. Not as the end of something, but as a continuation. Because the old rails gleamed one last time in the dying sun, and the crosses stood tall, and 47 names were carved in stone where once there had been only silence. Harold Brennan had spent 72 years looking for purpose. He'd found it in a storage unit, in his father's handwriting, in rails buried beneath the desert sand. And in finding it, He'd found forgiveness. For his father, for himself, for all the years they'd both spent carrying weight that wasn't theirs alone to bear. The desert grew dark, and the stars came out above the names carved in stone, and the forgotten men slept beneath the earth, remembered at last. Years later, Harold turned 75 in the spring of 2028. The Thomas Brennan Memorial Site had become one of Arizona's most visited historical landmarks, averaging 2,000 visitors monthly. School districts across the Southwest included it in curriculum about labor history and corporate accountability. Sarah's health remained stable, though she tired more easily now. They'd learned to measure life in smaller increments: good days, quiet mornings, evenings on their porch watching the sun set over the desert. The memorial had changed, grown. A small museum had been added, funded partly by Union Pacific's settlement and partly by Davy's bequest. Inside, visitors could see Thomas Brennan's original maps, photographs of the railway construction, artifacts recovered from the site. Interactive displays told the stories of individual workers: Wei Chen, who'd saved money to send home to his mother; Michael Brennan, who'd dreamed of buying his mother a house; Redbird, a Tohono O'odham man who'd taken the railway job to feed his family during a drought. The museum gave them faces, voices, lives beyond the dates on their crosses. Maria Santos won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting. She wrote a book about the Phoenix Extension, expanding her original article into a comprehensive history of labor abuses in the post-war American West. She dedicated it to Thomas Brennan and all the men who refused to let history be buried. Harold kept a copy on his nightstand. He'd read it 3 times, learning details about his father's life he'd never known. Thomas had been decorated in the Navy during World War II. He'd saved 2 men from a burning ship off Okinawa. He'd come home a hero and taken a job with the railroad because it was the only work available to a veteran with a high school education and a widowed mother to support. And then, 2 years later, he'd watched his brother die in the desert heat. The weight of that, carrying Michael's death, carrying 46 other deaths, carrying the company's secrets for 30 years, it would have broken most men. Thomas Brennan had bent, had nearly shattered, but had never fully broken. Harold understood his father now in ways he never could have before. Understood that the drinking, the silence, the distance, they'd been symptoms of a wound that couldn't heal. Understood that his father had been fighting a war no one knew about, maintaining a memorial no one could see, keeping faith with the dead while the living called him a failure. "I wish I could tell him I understand," Harold said one evening. He and Sarah sat on their porch, watching the sky turn purple and gold. "I wish I could tell him I'm proud." Sarah took his hand. "He knows." "You think so?" "I think that's why the maps found you," Sarah said. "Your father spent his life documenting everything, because he believed someday someone would care. And you cared enough to follow rails into the desert with your last $200. That's not coincidence. That's grace." Harold squeezed her hand, grateful for 42 years with a woman who could find grace in storage units and buried railways. They received a letter in June 2028 from the Department of the Interior. The secretary wanted to present Harold with the Citizens Medal for Public Service, specifically for extraordinary efforts to bring closure to families, preserve forgotten history, and ensure justice for marginalized workers. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. in July. Harold had never been to the Capitol. He and Sarah flew for the first time in 20 years, and Harold spent the flight looking out the window at the country passing below. Vast, beautiful, full of stories buried like rails beneath the sand. The secretary, a woman named Patricia Herrera, presented the medal in a room full of dignitaries Harold didn't recognize. But standing in the front row were faces he did know: Linda Chen and her family, Joseph Kowalski's nephew, 3 other descendants of the forgotten men, Maria Santos. Harold Brennan could have sold those maps, Secretary Herrera said in her remarks. He could have kept quiet about what he found. He and his wife were struggling financially. They had every reason to look the other way, to let the past stay buried. She paused, looking at Harold. Instead, they chose to honor the dead. They chose to finish a fight one man had waged alone for 30 years. They chose to ensure that 47 forgotten lives would be remembered. The medal was heavy in Harold's hands, bronze with an eagle on one side and the inscription "For service to the American people" on the other. But what Harold treasured most was what came after the ceremony. Linda Chen approached him, her eyes wet. "I took my grandmother's ashes to my grandfather's grave last month. I was finally able to lay them to rest together. 68 years after he died, she's with him again." She hugged Harold, and he felt her shake with sobs. "You gave me my family back. You gave all of us our families back." That night, back in their hotel room, Harold placed the medal on the dresser and looked at it for a long time. Sarah came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I hope so," Harold replied. "I spent so many years making him ashamed." "You spent the years that mattered making him honored," Sarah corrected. "That's what counts." Harold's health began to fail in the autumn of 2029. Small things at first: difficulty breathing, fatigue that sleep didn't cure. The doctor diagnosed congestive heart failure. Not immediately life-threatening, but progressive. Harold was 76. He'd lived a full life. He started visiting the memorial more frequently, as if storing up memories for whatever came next. He'd walk the railway line slowly, stopping at each grave, speaking to the men buried there like they were old friends. "Hey, Wei," he'd say to the teenager's headstone, "your great-grandson graduated college last month. Engineering degree. Linda says he's got your brains." Or, "Michael, I think about you and Dad a lot, about how young you both were, about how much life you should have had." Or, standing at the Central Cross, "I hope I did right by you all. I hope this place matters. I hope people remember." People did remember. The memorial had been featured in documentaries, history textbooks, museum exhibits across the country. It had become a pilgrimage site for labor activists, for families researching lost relatives, for anyone who understood that the stories we bury don't disappear, they just wait to be found. On Harold's 77th birthday, the memorial held a celebration in his honor. 200 people came. They'd organized a fundraiser for the scholarship program, raising enough money to send 10 students to college. Linda Chen gave a speech. "My grandfather Wei Chen died when he was 16, building a railway that made other men rich. He was treated as disposable, expendable, forgettable." She looked at Harold. But Thomas Brennan refused to forget. And Harold Brennan refused to let his father's work be lost. Because of them, my grandfather has a name, a grave, a legacy. His great-grandson carries that name now, and he knows where he comes from. She raised her glass. "To Thomas Brennan, who kept the faith, and to Harold Brennan, who finished the fight." The crowd echoed, "To the Brennans." Harold cried openly, and wasn't ashamed. Sarah held his hand, and around them, descendants of the forgotten men embraced, laughed, remembered together. This was what his father had fought for. Not money or fame, but this: community, memory, justice. This was what happened when someone refused to let the dead stay buried. Harold Brennan died on March 3, 2031, at the age of 78. Sarah was holding his hand. His last words were, "Tell Dad I finished it." The memorial service was held at the Thomas Brennan Memorial Site, at Harold's request. More than 500 people attended: descendants, historians, activists, strangers who'd been moved by the story. Maria Santos gave the eulogy. She spoke about a man who'd spent his last $200 on a storage unit and found a mission. About a son who'd finally understood his father. About courage that looks like following rails into the desert because it's the right thing to do. Harold Brennan wasn't a wealthy man, Maria said. He wasn't powerful or famous. He was just someone who saw an injustice and decided he couldn't live with staying silent. That's the most dangerous kind of person to the powerful, the ordinary citizen who decides enough is enough. She looked at the crosses standing behind her. These 47 men died forgotten. Thomas Brennan spent his life refusing to forget them. Harold Brennan spent his final years making sure the world wouldn't forget them either. That's a legacy that matters more than money or power. That's a legacy that changes history. Harold was buried in a family plot in Mesa, next to where Jennifer's ashes had been interred. But a memorial stone was placed for him at the site, near his father's, near Michael's. The inscription read, Harold Brennan, 1948-2031. He followed the rails and found the truth. Sarah lived another 6 years. She spent them volunteering at the memorial, telling visitors about Harold and Thomas, about the day they'd followed maps into the desert and found a hidden history. She watched the memorial grow. A Native American garden was added, honoring Red Bird and 3 other indigenous workers who died on the line. The memorial had been expanded twice, now including a research center where historians studied labor movements and corporate accountability. 3 generations of descendants gathered: Wei Chen's great-great-grandchildren, Michael Brennan's great-nieces and nephews who'd never known he existed until Harold's discovery, families whose last names appeared in Thomas Brennan's journal, families who'd spent decades wondering what had happened to men who'd gone to find work and never returned. They came to remember, to honor, to refuse to forget. The keynote speaker was a labor historian named Dr. James Kowalski, Joseph Kowalski's great-grandson, one of the first recipients of the Memorial Scholarship Program. He'd written his doctoral dissertation on the Phoenix Extension, expanding it into a book that was now required reading in labor history courses across the country. The story of this place is a story about power, Dr. Kowalski said, about how institutions protect themselves by erasing inconvenient truths. But it's also a story about resistance, about one man, Thomas Brennan, who refused to participate in erasure, about his son Harold, who refused to let his father's work die, about all of us who gather here to say, we remember, we honor, we demand better. He gestured to the crosses, still standing after 50 years of preservation. These 47 men were meant to disappear, but they didn't, because someone cared enough to mark their graves, because someone else cared enough to tell their stories, because all of you care enough to be here today. The crowd stood in silence, hundreds of people bearing witness to lives that had almost been erased. And somewhere in that silence, if you listened closely, you could almost hear it. The sound of rails being laid, of men working in impossible heat, of a young foreman named Thomas Brennan stacking stones over his brother's grave and promising, I won't let you be forgotten. A promise kept across decades, across generations, across the long arc of history, bending finally, impossibly, toward justice. The desert wind moved through the memorial garden, rustling the leaves of ironwood trees planted in memory of the dead. Visitors walked the railway line, now paved with interpretive trails, but still following the exact path the forgotten men had laid in 1952. Children asked their parents questions. Why did they die? Why didn't anyone help them? Why did it take so long for people to know? And parents answered, because powerful people didn't care. But one man did, and he taught his son to care. And now we all know to care. The sun set over the Superstition Mountains, painting the sky in colors like remembrance, like redemption, like the kind of justice that comes slow but arrives inevitable as stone. And in the cooling evening air, the old rails gleamed one last time, no longer buried, no longer forgotten, no lost, just remembered, honored, protected, the way Thomas Brennan had always believed they should be, the way Harold Brennan had made sure they would be, the way they would remain, as long as people came to this place and refused to let silence win. The crosses stood tall against the darkening sky, and the forgotten men, at long last, rested in peace.